Amina was 25 years old and a student at Amila Obi University of Science and Technology in Kano, Nigeria. She had always been ambitious, determined to rise above her humble beginnings. Her parents had sacrificed everything to send her to university. They lived in a small town outside of Kano, and her father, a mechanic, worked long hours just to make sure his daughter could stay in school. Her mother sold goods at the market, saving every penny for Amina's education. They were proud of her and often talked about her becoming an engineer, someone who would build a better life for the family. Amina carried these dreams with her to university. She had been determined to make them proud, to succeed, and to bring joy to her family. When she first stepped onto the campus, everything felt possible. The tall buildings, the busy classrooms, the energy of other students pursuing their own futures, it all filled her with excitement. But soon, the reality of university life began to sink in. Amina was intelligent and hardworking, but she quickly realized that the workload was overwhelming. The assignments were endless, and the exams were even tougher than she had imagined. The lecturers, strict and demanding, seemed uninterested in helping students who fell behind. Amina did her best, but by the middle of her first year, she was struggling in one of her core courses, anatomy. It was a critical course for her degree, and if she failed it, she wouldn't be able to continue. The pressure was unbearable. She would stay up late studying, her textbooks spread out across her small dorm room, but no matter how hard she worked, her grades were slipping. When she got her midterm results and saw the failing grade in anatomy, her heart sank. She couldn't fail. Failing meant going back home in shame, disappointing her parents, and possibly losing her place at the university. The fear of failure consumed her. Her friends noticed how withdrawn she had become. Hawa and Miriam, her closest friends since their first year, often tried to get her to join them for study sessions or just to relax and take her mind off the stress. "Amina, you've been studying non-stop," Hawa said one evening as they sat in their hostel room, textbooks open but largely forgotten. "You need a break." "I can't afford to take a break," Amina replied, her voice tight with anxiety. "I'm failing anatomy. If I don't pass, it's over for me." Miriam glanced at her with concern. "You're putting too much pressure on yourself. We're all struggling. Maybe you should talk to the lecturer. Ask for help." Amina sighed. "I don't think Dr. Sule cares about helping anyone." It was true. Dr. Sule was known for being one of the toughest lecturers in the department. He rarely gave second chances, and his exams were notoriously difficult. But there were rumors whispered among the female students that there was another way to pass his course. Some girls hinted at private meetings with him, meetings that had nothing to do with academics. Amina had overheard these conversations, but she had always dismissed them. She didn't believe it at first, or maybe she just didn't want to. But as the semester wore on and her grades continued to fall, Amina began to consider what she had once thought unthinkable. One evening, after another failed quiz, she found herself standing outside Dr. Sule's office, her heart racing with fear and guilt. She knocked lightly, her hand trembling. When his voice called her in, she pushed the door open and stepped inside. Dr. Sule sat behind his desk, a small, knowing smile spreading across his face when he saw her. "Amina," he said, his voice smooth, "to what do I owe the pleasure?" Her mouth felt dry, and she had to force the words out. I'm struggling with the course, sir. I'm afraid I'm going to fail." He leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. "Anatomy is a challenging subject. Many students struggle with it, but I'm sure there are ways to improve your situation." Amina felt a chill run down her spine. She knew what he was implying, but hearing it spoken aloud made her stomach turn. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "I need to pass this course," she said quietly. Dr. Sule stood up and walked around his desk, stopping just inches away from her. His eyes traveled over her, lingering too long on places that made her feel uncomfortable. "There are things you can do for me, Amina, and in return, I'll make sure you pass." Amina's hands clenched into fists at her sides, but she didn't pull away. She knew this was wrong, but the fear of failing, of going back home in disgrace, outweighed her guilt. She nodded, barely able to meet his gaze. That night marked the beginning of Amina's descent into a life she had never imagined for herself. What she thought would be a one-time compromise soon became a pattern. With every course that posed a challenge, she sought out lecturers like Dr. Sule, men who were willing to trade grades for favors. Her grades improved, but with each passing semester, she felt herself slipping further away from the person she used to be. By her second year, Amina had perfected her approach. She no longer felt the same fear or hesitation when dealing with her lecturers. It became a strategy, a means to an end. She knew which lecturers were susceptible, and she knew how to use her charm to get what she needed. But the weight of her actions hung heavily on her heart. She told herself that it was necessary, that it was the only way to survive in a system that was stacked against her. But deep down, she knew she was losing herself. Her friends, Hawa and Miriam, noticed the change in her. Amina no longer joined them for study sessions, and she became distant, often disappearing for hours at a time without explanation. When they asked her about her grades, she brushed off their questions with vague answers. One evening, as they sat together in the campus cafeteria, Hawa finally confronted her. "Amina, we're worried about you," she said, her voice full of concern. "You've changed. You're always distant, and you don't seem like yourself anymore." Amina looked down at her plate, avoiding her friend's gaze. "I'm just busy with school, that's all." Miriam leaned forward, her brow furrowed. "We're all busy with school, but you're different. You're always disappearing, and you never talk about your studies anymore. If something is going on, you can tell us." Amina's throat tightened. She wanted to tell them the truth, to unload the burden she had been carrying for so long. But how could she? How could she explain what she had done? The shame was too much. "I'm fine," she lied, forcing a smile. "Really. I just need to focus right now." Her friends exchanged worried glances, but they didn't push her further. Amina was grateful for that, but the guilt gnawed at her. She had lost her connection to them, and it hurt more than she wanted to admit. By her third year, Amina had built her life around the secret she kept. She had continued to use her body as a bargaining tool, trading it for grades with lecturers who were more than willing to exploit her. Her grades were higher than ever, and she was one of the top students in her department. To the outside world, Amina seemed like a success story, an example of determination and hard work. But inside, she was crumbling. She had lost the joy she once felt for learning. The excitement that had filled her when she first arrived at university was long gone. Now, she only felt trapped in the choices she had made, bound by the lies she had told. It was around this time that Amina began to notice changes in her body. She was often tired, more so than usual, and she found herself getting sick more frequently. At first, she thought it was just stress. University life was exhausting, and she had been pushing herself hard. But when the symptoms worsened, she knew something was wrong. One morning, after waking up drenched in sweat and feeling lightheaded, Amina went to the campus clinic. She hoped it was nothing serious, maybe just a passing illness. But after the doctor ran a series of tests, the results came back with devastating news. "I'm afraid you've tested positive for HIV, the doctor said, his voice gentle but firm. Amina stared at him, her mind reeling. HIV? How was this possible? She felt like the ground had been ripped out from under her. The room seemed to spin, and her heart pounded in her chest. She had heard about HIV, of course, but she never thought it could happen to her. She had been careful, hadn't she? The doctor continued speaking, explaining the importance of starting treatment, of managing her health, but Amina barely heard him. Her mind was flooded with images of her past, the choices she had made, the people she had been with, the risks she had taken. The strategy that she had relied on for survival now felt like a curse. Amina left the clinic in a daze, her feet heavy as if the weight of the world had settled on her shoulders. The walk back to her dorm felt like a blur, the faces of other students passing by unnoticed, the sound of their laughter distant and hollow. Inside, she was screaming, but outside, she kept her composure, moving mechanically as though her body was on autopilot. When she reached her room, Amina collapsed on her bed. For hours, she lay there staring at the ceiling, her mind spiraling with thoughts. HIV. It wasn't just a sickness, it was a mark, a symbol of everything she had done wrong. She felt dirty, ashamed, and utterly lost. How would she tell her family? How would she tell anyone? Who would care about her now? Tears welled up in her eyes, and before she knew it, she was sobbing uncontrollably. The sobs came from a place deep inside her, a place filled with regret and self-loathing. She had ruined her life. What had started as a means to an end had now become the very thing that destroyed her. In the days that followed, Amina isolated herself. She stopped attending lectures, stopped answering her friends' calls. She barely left her room, avoiding the outside world and all the people who might ask questions. Hawa and Miriam knocked on her door repeatedly, their voices filled with concern, but Amina couldn't face them. How could she explain what she had done? How could she admit that she had contracted a disease because of her own decisions? One evening, after several days of silence, Amina finally opened the door to Hawa, her face pale and her eyes sunken from lack of sleep. "Amina," Hawa gasped, rushing forward to hug her. "We've been so worried. What's going on? You've been ignoring us." Amina stood there, stiff and unmoving in Hawa's embrace. She didn't have the strength to pretend anymore. She sank into the bed as Hawa sat beside her, concern etched across her face. I've made a lot of mistakes," Amina said, her voice barely above a whisper. Hawa's eyes softened. "What do you mean? Everyone makes mistakes, Amina. You can tell me." Amina shook her head, tears welling up once again. "Not like this. I've ruined everything, Hawa." Miriam joined them a few minutes later, sitting quietly as Amina struggled to find the words. The silence in the room grew thick as Amina fought to keep her composure. She didn't want them to see her like this, but she couldn't keep the truth inside anymore. She needed to tell someone, to say it out loud, even if it meant losing their friendship. "I have HIV, Amina finally confessed, her voice cracking. The room went still. Hawa's face turned pale, and Miriam's mouth opened slightly in shock, but neither of them spoke for a long moment. Amina could see the disbelief in their eyes, the fear creeping into their expressions. She couldn't blame them. This wasn't what they expected. "What?" Hawa finally whispered. How? How did this happen?" Amina took a shaky breath, wiping her tears. "I made a terrible mistake. I've been sleeping with lecturers to get better grades. I thought it was the only way, but now I've lost everything." Miriam looked at her, speechless, while Hawa's eyes filled with tears. Neither of them had imagined that this was what Amina had been hiding. They had always seen her as the strong one, the girl who could handle anything. But now, they realized just how much she had been struggling, and it broke their hearts. "Oh, Amina," Hawa said, her voice trembling. "Why didn't you tell us? We could have helped you." Amina shook her head. "How could I tell anyone? I was so ashamed. I didn't want you to think less of me." "We're your friends," Miriam finally spoke, her voice thick with emotion. "We don't care about what you did. We just care about you. You didn't have to go through this alone." The sincerity in their voices made Amina cry even harder. She hadn't realized how much she needed to hear that, how much she had needed to feel loved despite her mistakes. Hawa and Miriam wrapped their arms around her, holding her as she wept. For the first time in months, Amina didn't feel entirely alone. But even their support couldn't undo what had been done. Amina's life had been derailed in ways she couldn't fix. She still had HIV, and no matter how much her friends cared, they couldn't change that. Her academic career was over, her future destroyed by the very shortcuts she had taken to succeed. After a few more weeks of isolation and soul-searching, Amina knew she had to face her parents. The thought terrified her more than anything else. They had sacrificed so much for her education, believing she would be their beacon of hope, their escape from poverty. How could she tell them that she had thrown it all away? With trembling hands, Amina dialed her mother's number. She hadn't spoken to her parents in weeks, and the sound of her mother's voice on the other end of the line brought a fresh wave of tears. "Amina, my daughter," her mother said, relief flooding her voice. "We've been worried sick. Why haven't you called? What's happening?" Amina took a deep breath, trying to steady her voice. "Mama, I need to talk to you and Papa. It's important." Her mother sensed the seriousness in her tone. "What's wrong, Amina? Is everything okay?" "No," Amina whispered. "Everything is not okay. I need to come home and explain. I'll be there tomorrow." When she hung up, her heart pounded with anxiety. The next day, Amina packed her bags and left the university campus for the last time. The journey home felt like a walk toward her own execution. Her thoughts raced with every possible reaction her parents might have. Would they be angry, disappointed, or worst of all, would they disown her? When she arrived home, her parents were waiting in the small living room, their faces etched with concern. Her father stood by the door, his arms crossed, while her mother sat on the edge of the couch, her hands wringing nervously. "Amina, what's going on?" her father asked, his voice gruff with worry. Amina stood before them, unable to hold back the tears. She had rehearsed what she was going to say, but now, standing in front of them, her words felt hollow. "I've made a terrible mistake," she began, her voice trembling. "I failed you. I failed everything you believed in me." Her mother's face crumpled with confusion. "What are you talking about, Amina? Just tell us." Amina's eyes filled with tears as she spoke the words that would change everything. "I have HIV." Her father's face darkened, and her mother gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The silence that followed was suffocating, heavy with disbelief and anger. "What do you mean, HIV?" her father demanded, his voice rising. "How did this happen?" Amina could barely look at them. She explained everything, the sleeping with lecturers for grades, the lies she had told, the infection that had shattered her life. Every word felt like a dagger to her own heart, and as she spoke, she could see the hurt and anger growing in her father's eyes. "You mean to tell me," her father shouted, his face red with fury, "that after everything we've done for you, you've been throwing your life away like this? You've disgraced this family." Amina's mother sobbed quietly, her hands trembling in her lap. She couldn't even look at her daughter. "I trusted you." Her father continued. "I worked day and night so you could have a better life. And this is what you've done? You're no longer welcome in this house. You've brought shame to us all." Amina's heart broke at his words. She had feared this moment, but hearing it said aloud was more painful than she had imagined. Her mother's silence was even worse. The disappointment in her eyes was unbearable. "Mama, please," Amina pleaded, her voice cracking. "Dad, I'm sorry. Please, forgive me," she pleaded, but her father wouldn't take that. He threw her out of the house. The news of her sickness spread both in her village and in school. Life became so hard for Amina, as she had no place to lay her head in the neighboring village, where she ran to out of shame and regret. 5 months later, her parents accepted her back into the house with heavy heart and disappointment. 2 years later, her friends in Hawa and Miriam came to visit her. They have graduated from the university and are now certified and practicing doctors. After they left, Amina couldn't take the suffering and regret anymore. All her childhood dreams all gone before her own eyes. The next day, the news of Amina's demise spread across the village. She had taken her own life the previous night, leaving behind a written note. Her mom slumped and died from the shocking news of her demise. In her written note, she wrote, "Hi, Mom and Dad. I'm sorry for failing you. I wish I could turn back the hands of time. I can't bear the suffering anymore. To my friends Miriam and Hawa, congratulations to you for what you both have become. Finally, to the lecturers who put me in this situation, may your daughters experience more pains than I did. I pray the Lord accepts my soul."